So I'm not lazy. I have a bad knee, and I'm practicing self-care. Which I strongly advocate for everybody in this room. I got to tell you, I had to laugh, Jay, when you were talking about cat food and, helping cats with consciousness. My son and daughter-in-law and grandchildren have chickens that they've raised since they were babies, and they also have cats that they've raised since they were kittens. And for some reason, whenever the chickens wander out of their yard, the cats go and herd them back into the yard. I have never heard about herding cats, but they must have gotten a hold of some of that conscious cat food. You never know. I'm going to have to ask them what kind of cat food they're feeding their cats. So today what we're going to talk about is what happens at the end of our lives. As Jay said, I've been present with over 1,000 individuals as they transition. And that includes newborn babies as well as people in their late 90s. Many, many years ago now, I worked at Children's Hospital before they had a hospice. And they had many children who were often born with congenital anomalies and other kind of disorders, and so they would be taken home to die, sometimes on ventilators, sometimes not on ventilators, and no one knew how long they were going to live. And then I also worked with families where children had cancer, and I did in-home family therapy with those folks, and it changed the course of my life. They became my teachers. And I learned many years ago that teaching through storytelling is much more powerful than talking to people by giving them a lot of facts. So I'm going to share some of what I've learned through stories of some of those that I've been with at end-of-life care. Okay? I think about it, and I think about how I got into that world. And it sort of happened serendipitously, as those kind of things happen to most of us. One day, I had a very thriving private practice. I was working with lots of traumatized individuals, children and adults, was good at it, went to court a lot, which was my least favorite thing to do. But one day, for the heck of it, I was looking through the Sunday papers. I have no idea why. And this job lit up. And it was at Children's. And I applied for the job. And it was almost like my soul applied for the job, because a part of me was just sort of following this energy. And I got offered it. And then they told me what the salary was, and it was literally about a quarter of what I was making. And I couldn't figure out how I was going to do that, and so I said I was really sorry, and I had to turn them down. But I couldn't get it out of my mind and out of my heart. There was something that was calling to me. And about 2-3 months later, the hospital called me back, and they said their second candidate hadn't worked out, and they'd really wanted me from the beginning. Would I reconsider? And I said, well, I'd love to reconsider. I really wanted the job, but I just have some challenges. So they asked me if I'd come in and talk to them, and I went in and talked to them. And what they negotiated with me is I could still do my private practice part-time and do the job part-time. And then eventually, and then they increased the salary a little bit from probably, I think back then it was $15 an hour to maybe $20. And back then, that was more money than that would be right now, but still it wasn't a lot in that field. And I trusted my guts. I trusted spirit and trusted intuition. And it's probably one of the many best decisions I've ever made in my life. So you're going to hear about some of the individuals who came into my life during that time. Let's see how we do it. So I later went on to work with adults. And I was working at Abbott Northwestern with adults. And one day a woman who I had worked with, who was getting close to the end of her life, gave me a poem. And it was this poem by Pablo Neruda. As each day falls inside each night, and clarity is imprisoned, we must sit on the rim of the edge of darkness and fish for fallen light with patience. And she told me that what my role in her life had been was to sit on that edge of darkness with her throughout her whole journey of cancer and hold a light in the dark. And if you think about it, that's true for all of us. Our job is to be present with people. It's not to change anything for them. And the greatest gift that we can give another is their presence. Well, back then, this is probably 25 years ago, I don't know that I knew all that much about that. But I'm going to tell you about a kid who taught me. So I was working at Children's, and I was working at Abbott by then, and a girl that I had first met when she was diagnosed with bone cancer really had a hard time when I had to say goodbye to her. She was back in for treatment, but she was pretty stable. Her name was Melissa, and one of the things she asked me to do one day, she said, and she, of course, had a bald head, and she said, "I want you to paint a butterfly on my head." I said, "Melissa, I'm not an artist. I don't know how to paint." And she said, "Anybody can do a butterfly." And she had the paints, etc. She'd had her mother bring. So that was the last time I had seen Melissa when I painted this butterfly. And she loved it, and we laughed, and we talked. So now I'm at Abbott, and I get a call from the social worker at Children's, and Melissa had had a reoccurrence, and it was a very serious reoccurrence, and nothing else could be offered to her medically. So she was facing the end of her life. She was now 17 years old. And the day that she was told that, she went home to clinic, and she turned off the lights, drew the shades, and it was now almost a month later, and she had not talked to a soul. All of her best friends had been to see her, her favorite oncologist, her favorite nurse practitioner, her auntie, her godmother, and the list was endless. And one day her mother began to cry, and she said, "Missy, please, won't you talk to someone?" And she said, "If you can find Lora Matz and she'll come and see me, maybe I'll talk to her." Well, I'll tell you, at that point in my career, nothing had prepared me for what it was like to walk in to that completely darkened room. You could feel the despair. And I asked her if I could turn a light on. I couldn't even see a chair to sit in. And she burst into tears, and she says, "Why does everybody come and feel like they have to change something? Why can't you just sit with me and be with me?" I apologized, and I sat down. She said, "The chair is right to your left. Just feel for it." And I sat, but there was no conversation, and I sat. About an hour passed, and I said, "I'm going to have to go now." And she said, "When can you come back?" And of course, I left that room, and her parents pounced on me and wanted to know if I'd gotten her to open up. And I said, "No, but she wants me to come back." I have to tell you, had I been younger or less experienced, I might have, over time, called Children's and said, "I just can't get her to open up. I don't think I'm useful to her at all." But something in me, even after weeks and weeks and weeks of sitting in silence in the dark, trusted that something was happening because she always wanted me to come back. And it was around that time that the patient who gave me this poem had given it to me, and this literally became a prayer, a mantra, that I just learn how to sit quietly in presence and be present for her. One day she said, and she had talked very little. Occasionally she'd reach for my hand. One day she said, "The worst thing about this damn disease when you're dying at my age is you don't have anything to leave for anybody. If I could just go shopping." And I forgot myself, and I said, "Well, you could go shopping. Your dad could get you up in the wheelchair." And she said, "Yeah, I look and smell like a effing freak. And you think I should go shopping, go out in public? Are you crazy? I'm sure I even smell bad." And I have to tell you, it took every single bit of control to not talk her out of her perception, to just let it be her perception and be present with her. The next time I went to see her, I don't know why, sometimes I think my car has a ghost that drives it or something, but my car found its way to JCPenney's, and then to Sears, and then to the old Spiegel, which were all on their way to her house. And I walked in with all of these catalogs, thinking this is how she could go shopping. I hadn't thought it through, really. I mean, it's like spirit sort of took over and took me to these places. I open the door, I walk in, and I say, "Missy, I brought you some catalogs." And then I said, "Oh shit, I'm so sorry. I don't want you to think that means you have to turn the lights on. And she started to laugh, and she says, oh, turn them on. She was curious. So that day we went shopping in catalogs, but she couldn't find anything. Then she opened up, and she was willing to let her parents move a TV into her room, and she started going shopping when I was there on daytime TV and the shopping channels. They sell so much junk on shopping channels. And of course, every time I get back to work, children's calls and says, well, did you get her to open up? And I said, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. One day she says to me, am I going to smell bad when I die? And I said, I've been with lots of people who've died, and I have never known of them to smell bad. And if that's something you're concerned about, you can choose what kind of essential oil you want in the room when you're dying. She said, do I have other choices? I said, absolutely. And we talked about all the choices she had. She could choose what kind of music she wanted playing, if she wanted music. She could choose who was in the room with her when she died. She could choose what she wanted to happen to her body after she died. So we had quite a talk about all of that. Not long after, I arrived one day, and all the lights were on, the curtains were open, and she was so excited because she had gotten up and had her dad take her shopping. And the room was filled with hundreds of butterfly mobiles and decals everywhere. And she said, isn't it exciting? I just had to go buy these for myself. And she said, and then I got presents for everybody. And then she scripted her death. And my job after she died was to give out the presents, her legacy. The day that Melissa was dying, her parents called me, and I learned by then that you can not only track the stages of death by what's going on physically in a person's body, but much more accurately, you can track that stage by what's going on energetically. Because we tend to die in the opposite direction than we're born. We tend to, and if you've ever seen any of Barbara Brennan's work, she talks about the fact that babies fully incarnate through the crown chakra and then slowly come in and fully inhabit the body. We die the opposite way. So literally one chakra after another from the root chakra burns up. So, and then issues that aren't worked through come to the surface during that time. And once that chakra has cleared, then that part of the body is without life force. So there may be a lot of heat and restlessness in the legs, and then once that particular energy center is cleared, literally, if you were to try to lift a leg, it would just flop down on the bed like a Raggedy Ann doll, because there's literally no life force in it. And that happens from the root chakra all the way up. So with people who die, who have hair loss or bald, often you can see a ring of fire in the top of their head. So I had prepared her parents, and much like a midwife helping to give birth to a baby, you can often tell what stage of birth that woman is in. And the same is true with death. So I prepared her parents, and they called me about an hour before she was dying. And her dad was sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, and he said, I don't think I can go in there. I just don't think I can go in there. And I want to drink so damn bad, I don't know what to do. And her dad was a recovering alcoholic at that point. And I sat on the couch with him and held his hand, and I said, I'm just going to trust that you're going to do what's best for you as well as Missy. And you get to decide that. Nobody can decide that for you. I'm going to go in and be with her now, and you're welcome to come in if you want to. And if it feels like you want to stay out here, you can be present with her out here in your own way. About a half hour later, he came in, and he had just gotten out of the shower. He said, I had to get cleaned up because somehow after you sat with me, I just felt like I'd be stepping into a sacred event. So her dad was with her. After she died, after she took her last breath and she died to music called Alleluia by Robert Gass, her dad says, I will never take another drink in my life. How could I after being present with that? And then her grandmother and her mother and I and her auntie dressed her in her prom dress after we bathed her body in rose water. That's how she wanted to be taken to the mortuary in her prom dress. The next morning, her mother called me all excited because butterflies were all over the bushes outside Melissa's window. So there's a lot to that story, and I'll let you unpack it yourself, but probably the most important thing for me was learning to really be present. You know, there were times, it literally was a mindfulness practice. There were times where the silence was so uncomfortable. There were times when I was almost scared to leave the room knowing somebody was going to ask me if I'd gotten her to talk. I had to drop my agenda and just trust that my presence was enough. And what I learned is when we're very, very present with another, presence with a capital P comes in and informs the space. And that's sacred space. And that's where real medicine is. And it doesn't have to occur just at the end of life care. It can occur in every interaction we have. So another story. This is a little guy named Andrew, and Andrew was 3 when this picture was taken. And I first met Andrew when he was 2. And he had the worst form of childhood cancer an infant can get. The prognosis at that point was 1%. So he had to go through intensive chemotherapy, surgery to remove a kidney and a tumor wrapped around one of his kidneys, more chemotherapy, and then the only way to get this kind of aggressive cancer to back off is through a transplant. So then his family and he moved from St. Paul Children's, which they always called the little hospital, to the University of Minnesota where he had the transplant. He nearly died. He was in a coma for several weeks. His mama was a writer, and her journal was filled. She wrote every single day of his treatment. A year later, when Andrew's now 3, he's doing great. He's thriving. But Mama is dealing with her trauma of having gone through that and some of her fears and projections. She really believed that Andrew would have developmental disorders, and she couldn't see this vital, alive little boy there, and there was no evidence of any kind of problem. So I was working with her intensely, and her journals had become like Pandora's box. She was afraid to open them, so I was having her read short portions of them and either giving her meditations or doing mandalas for those sections to begin to transform the energy in her associations with them. She went home one afternoon from seeing me, and she was going to face reading about the time when they were in the big hospital, when Andrew was in the coma. And she sat down, and Andrew was playing with some trucks on the floor, and he looked up almost as though he knew what his mom was doing. He says, "Mommy, remember when I was in the big hospital stuck way up high in that tree?" And his mom said, "No, Andrew, I don't remember." And he said, "Yes, you do. You and Daddy were there." And this good, intuitive mom says, "Remind me." And if you know about 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, they think we know everything. So he couldn't possibly comprehend. She didn't know what he was talking about. So she said, "Remind me." And he said, "When I was in the big hospital, I was stuck way up high in that tree, and there were monsters at the bottom. And then a pink angel and a purple angel came and rocked me for a while and told me they weren't monsters, they were just doctors and nurses. And then they took me all the way down through the tree and back into my body, and there I was, back with you and Daddy." So this child is talking about what it was like to come back into the physical body from the spirit realm. And what his mama didn't know, they weren't churchgoers, they'd never talked about angels. And she didn't know that the tree of life is a symbol that comes up in every spiritual tradition. The Kabbalah spends a lot of time talking about the tree of life and teaching about the tree of life. And where is the tree of life? It's in our bodies. We are the tree of life. And you can see, it's kind of hard in here to see, you can see in the placenta the tree of life, as well as the bottom of the foot of the baby. So I moved away from the Twin Cities for a while, and I was the director of a program in Tucson that worked using equine therapy and a whole lot of other things with cancer survivors. And I'd stayed in touch with Andrew and his family. And Andrew wanted to come to one of our retreats because he was too little to have been in any kind of group when he was little. His cancer was totally gone. He has never had any problem again. He's now in college. But he wanted to be with other kids, and he loves animals. So they came to an equine retreat, and what we used to do is we used to give the kids, they draw a straw, and then they get to just point to which field of horses they wanted to go into. They then were assigned to a specific horse. They were given a bridle and halter and told to go get their horse and to bring it into the round pen. And a volunteer horse handler who was a specialist, and here that is the woman over here, and Andrew's mom is over here. They go with the child, but they can't do it for him, and they can't tell him how to do it. If I asked you to go out in the back 40 and get a horse and bring it in, what would come up for you? Just throw some things out. What would come up for you? I don't know how to do it. What else? Anxiety, right. What else? I can't do that. What else? Anybody afraid of the horse? That's right. What if I get stepped on? This horse doesn't like me. We stopped doing this with adult cancer survivors because after a half hour, they'd still be running around in the field trying to chase the horse. Because horses have very expanded energy bodies. And when we enter into proximity with them, if we're dissonant, they pick that up and it puts them on hypervigilance. So the kids always got their horses very quickly. In this particular weekend, Andrew got his within just a few minutes. So we circle up, and if you know anything about horses, the bridle and the bit isn't even in his mouth, and it's upside down. But hey, I got the horse. You just said get the horse, bring it in. That's the point here. An adult would have gotten worried about that and gotten stressed by that. I don't know how to get this in right. I'm sure this isn't right, and they would have kept repeating it, right? Children tend to break things down to less complex, more simple facts. So we're standing in circle, and I said, so Andrew, how did you get your horse so fast? And he looked at us, and he says, it was easy. I just talked to her with my heart and closed my eyes and asked her to come and help me. So she did. So this little guy literally saw the horse, and the horse was about as far from here to that back door. The horse looked up, glanced at him. He closed his eyes, put his hand on his heart, and waited, and the horse literally walked up to him and put her head down. And I could fill the morning with stories like that of how other children got their horses intuitively. And there's some wisdom in that. It was easy. I just talked to her with my heart. So often, we as adults, when we get anxious or we go into socialized mode, we become talking heads. We stop both listening from our hearts as well as talking with our hearts. And that's something that I've learned from Andrew as well as a whole lot of others. So Jesse, wow. Jesse was another 17-year-old, and he had brain cancer. It was first diagnosed when he was 12, and I didn't know him then because I hadn't worked there then. And he was brought into Children's with seizures, and MRI showed that his cancer had spread, and there was nothing else they could do for Jesse. So they consciously sedated him for a period of time to give the brain a chance to rest so that then they could bring him out of the conscious sedation. I asked his parents if he'd ever gotten to do a Make-A-Wish, and they said no, but we know exactly what he wants. He's wanted it since he was first diagnosed for some reason, and we've just never been able to afford it because we're they were a poor farm family in southern Minnesota. And I said, what does he want? They said he wants an authentic teepee. I said, do you know why? They had no idea. Well, Children's Make-A-Wish wasn't willing to grant that wish because he had such a foreshortened future. We're looking at a couple of months. And thought it was a waste of money, and they tried to talk us into Disney World. But Children's at that time had something called the We Believe Fund. Instead of staff contributing money to United Way drives, we did our own drive called We Believe Fund, and we could go to that to get anything that a family needed. So I was able to get the funds from the We Believe Fund and called the Historical Society, who knew a man in South Dakota who made authentic teepees, and he could put it together with the instructions and ship it out and ship it to the family's home. So the day we told Jesse that there was nothing else that medically could be done for him, he looked at us all and he says, yep, I know, but I have a few more things to do. And then his mom told him about the teepee. And he got really excited, and he said to his dad, don't you dare put that teepee up till I get home. I've been studying these things for a lot of years now. And his dad assured him that he wouldn't. And so the day Jesse went home, the teepee was there, and he laid in a lawn chair because by then his balance was so off he couldn't stand, and he instructed his dad and his brother how to set it up in a sacred way. Because those of you who don't know about teepees, the entryway has to be in a particular direction, the poles have to be set up in a particular way, etc., etc. There's a whole ritual around that, and Jesse had literally studied that. So at the end of the CARE conference, everyone got up to leave, and he said, hey, will you wait a minute, I want to talk to you. And I said, sure, what's up, Jesse? And he looks at me and he says, why did you go to all that trouble to get me the teepee? And I said, well, I felt like you had a right to your last wish. He says, don't give me social work bullshit. Why did you really get me the teepee? Talk about being asked to be authentic. And I got quiet for several minutes, and I reflected, and I said, Jesse, it's a hard one because it was so intuitive, but the best answer I can give you is I have a feeling that teepee has something to do with your spirit. And I don't even know exactly what that means, but it just feels like, I don't know, it was a spiritual request, and I don't know where that comes from. He says, yup. He says, when I was first diagnosed with my brain tumor at 12, I had a dream that I was going to die in a sacred manner in a teepee. He said, so since you've told me the truth, will you do something else for me? And I said, sure. And he said, would you be willing to have a going away ceremony before I die in the teepee with my family and friends? So that's what we did. We did a going away ceremony. And I went back and forth down to St. Peter to help his family and friends get ready for it. I found a great big basket that we called the blessing basket. And Jesse wanted all of his friends to bring a story about him, as well as his family. And Jesse also, the real reason he wanted to have that going away ceremony is Jesse had made meaning of his journey by studying all of Joseph Campbell's work on the hero's journey. And Jesse believed that he was a hero on a journey, and that's how he'd made meaning of his journey. And that his job before he died was to bring back the wisdom that he'd learned in the dark. I myself didn't know a thing about the hero's journey before then, but I got to tell you, I immersed myself in studying it afterwards. So before we get to the going away ceremony, one day I arrived, and Jesse was really excited, and he had a story to tell me, and his mom was excited. A man from somewhere in South Dakota had dreamt about Jesse, had both hitchhiked and walked into the town that he was from, didn't know where he lived, just had figured out somehow the town. And he went from merchant to merchant asking, do you know of a boy who's going to die in a teepee? Do you know a boy who has a teepee who's dying? And finally found the right merchant who drove him out to the family's farm. And he showed up at the door, and he had gone to Pipestone, and he had carved a pipe for Jesse. And he spent the afternoon teaching him how to smoke the pipe in a ceremonial manner. So, of course, the oncologist and I that day had to smoke the pipe. The day of the ceremony, one of the stories was told by his best friend from kindergarten, and what he brought as a symbolic object to put in the basket was a picture of Luke Skywalker with Yoda on his back. And he said, Jesse has always embodied wisdom since he was in kindergarten. And I always listen to you, Jesse, because you're so wise. And Jesse said, thanks, I know. That's real humility. Another one of his best friends, a girl, brought a box of condoms. And you could see all the adults kind of sitting up. And his mother like... It turns out that when other kids would be off necking and all that sort of thing, as kids are prone to do at a certain age, Jesse was never allowed to drive because he could have a seizure. So his female friend would drive the car, and he'd ride shotgun, and they'd stop at the local pharmacy and buy up all their condoms and then go find their friends. And then knock on the windows of their cars and say, if you're gonna be stupid, at least be safe, and throw the condoms at them. And it turned out that this young woman had a sexual abuse history. And she said, I feel healed because of those nights with Jesse. And the stories were endless. At the end of the ceremony, I said, Jesse, so how do you want to finish off the rest of your days with your family and friends? And he said, oh, I don't know about that. I said, does that mean you're playing it by ear? And he looked at me like I was kind of dense, which I was being kind of dense in that moment, I guess. And he says, well, I guess so, and winked at me. That night, he asked to sleep in the teepee with his best friend and his dad, and he died in his sleep. And his dad woke to the sound of the call of an eagle circling the teepee. Would you say that's conscious dying? And a very old soul. So Jesse had a whole bunch of isms, Jesse-isms. Experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens. That was one of his favorite quotes. And to know something as wisdom, then, we must be scrubbed raw, the fasting heart exposed. And then one of his own isms, Jesse-isms, was shit happens, just stay away from crabby people when it does. Good advice, right? So remember that one. Shit happens, just stay away from crabby people. And if you think about it, when shit happens, when we're feeling kind of down in the dumps, when we seek out people who are crabby and sort of in the same place, they reinforce us, rather helping us to see where we're maybe kind of been blindsided or how we could move to a more expanded way of seeing what's in front of us. I have a number of friends like that, and a number of years ago I was getting ready to start a new job, and I can't even say what I said, but Michelle reached across the table, patted my hand after she dramatically set down her coffee cup, and she says, Lora Matz, that's the biggest bunch of shit I've heard come out of your mouth in years. We all need people like that, who really have our backs and can see our blinders and that aren't crabby people. All right. That's hard to read. But it's important, so I'm going to take a minute to do it. There's an emotional current that carries us along through life-giving, through life-giving, an impetus to seek more, to dive deeper and live on more than the surface of our lives. This undersong creates a holy longing. This undersong creates a holy longing. What death did is it created that holy longing in me, and being around so much of the energy of death created a longing to go more deeply inward. The necessary thing is great turning inward, and inner solitude is necessary. What goes on inwardly is worthy of your love. So this is a story I wasn't sure I was going to get to or whether I was going to tell you, but I've decided to tell you. It's to me, a very, very sacred story that took me many years to understand. One of the families that I had been assigned to was a family with a baby that was born premature. And I first met them when they were in the transitional care unit. And the transitional care unit was a place where the mother would begin to learn cares for their baby on a ventilator. As well as staff would be trained in from a home care agency on that baby's specific cares so that the baby could go home. This particular baby, named Chantel, was thriving, and she reminded me of a baby Buddha. And in spite of the fact that she had a trach, so you couldn't hear her sound, when she smiled, it's like the sun came out, and you could almost hear the chortle, even though you couldn't hear it auditorily. And she was scheduled to be what's called decannulated, have the trach come out and slowly be weaned off the vent. One night, the home care agency, which always provided nursing care at night, sent a nurse who was new, who hadn't been properly trained on the vent. Baby, by now, was probably about 18 months old. She was going to be a success case. And the nurse, part of the nursing chores was to take apart the vent tubing, clean it, and then put her back on it immediately after. She did that, and she put it together wrong. So when the morning nurse came on, baby was very what's called dusky and not breathing. And the rest of the night she'd been breathing through something smaller than a straw and not getting enough oxygen. So they did what's called bag her, which means instead of compressions with a baby who has a trach, etc., it's almost like a bellows that they put in the trach to try to, or not in the trach, in the venting tubing, to try to bring her breath back, and she was rushed to Children's. The neurologist was very concerned. He said he wanted to give it 48 hours because there was so much swelling in her brain from lack of oxygen. And I was at the hospital all weekend with the family. And I went home on Monday after we had a care conference. And in the care conference, they were told that there was nothing that could be done, that she was going to be in a permanent vegetative state. She had suffered so much damage. And they recommended that the mom take her off the vent. And Mom went pretty much berserk. And she said, I have had to come to love this like it's another limb, and now you're telling me to just unplug it? I can't do it. I can't do it. And I left the hospital just so sad. And I went home, and I laid across the bed, and I went into this, it wasn't sleep, it was this deep meditative place. And what I saw is I saw myself back at the hospital, and I left my body standing in the doorway, and I entered Chantel's body with her. And from then on, I could feel the work of the vent. I could see shadows of people. And then we saw together hundreds of geometric shapes with brilliant light shining through them. And then I felt us picked up by something, someone familiar, and held close to someone. And literal tears falling on the skin of baby. And then could feel this murmuring and this sound, and then literally felt this release. And at that point, the geometric shapes, which had kind of backed off into the distance, they became even more prominent, and the diamond shape came as close as it possibly could. And as the baby went through the diamond shape, I saw hundreds of bluebirds and I sat up saying, "Fly, baby bird, fly." I thought, whoa, what was that? And I'm sort of disoriented from it. And I pulled loose from her consciousness at that moment. And I went looking for my pager. That tells you how many years ago it was. And I hadn't realized I'd left it in the garage in my car. And I noticed that the hospital had been trying to call me. Mom had asked her family to go to dinner. She was a single mom. And wanted to spend time alone with the baby, and sat telling baby Chantel, "It's okay for you to leave. I can't take you off this event, but if you want to leave, it's okay to go. I'll never forget you, and I'll always remember everything you taught me." And she said, and I cried all over her, and baby died in her arms. So I'm back at the hospital with the family, and the mom was a smoker, and she said, "Would you just go stand out in front? I just really need a cigarette." And we're standing in front of Children's, and on this little tree, and it was February, there's a bluebird singing its heart out. And I didn't say anything to her at that point. It wasn't till the day of the memorial service. But the day of the memorial service, we were at the grandmother's house, and she was rinsing dishes. She'd had a luncheon for everyone. And all of a sudden, she was at the sink where she washing dishes. She says, "Joelle, Laura, come here, hurry." And on her windowsill was a bluebird singing its heart out. A year later, baby Chantel's mother sent me this as a Christmas card. It's called "Night and Her Train of Stars." If you look closely of it, the baby being carried as well as the angel is covered in bluebird feathers. I'm writing a book, and for the heck of it, I thought, I wonder where the artist got the inspiration for that. Did a little research, and the title, "Night in Her Train of Stars," was based on a poem written by a man who's writing about death. And that night, as an angel in her train of stars, comes to you. And of course, she didn't know that. She got it thinking it was just a Christmas card. There's so much mystery in the world. Also, there are so many people dying in nursing homes to daytime TV. If I have something in my advance directives, it's spare me from daytime TV. I've gone into more nursing homes and turned off daytime TV. It's jarring to the spirit that's trying to leave. And when you ask people, it's lack of education. I'll say, "Why do you have daytime TV on?" "So-and-so's not going to want to die to Days of Our Lives. She never even liked it when she was okay." And what I get again and again is, "I just want them to have some company." But it's a lack of education, of them not knowing that's not appropriate company. That's not an appropriate way to honor a life that's been well lived. So there's so much need for education in this area. So the last thing I want to say is, for the last 15 years, a good friend of mine, Lyndall Johnson, who's Yvette Erasmus's mother, and Yvette has spoken here a number of times, she and I do a workshop called Midwifing Conscious Dying. And we teach people about all the stages of dying, and that you look at your own death. We have you do some work on looking at what would be your ideal death and what would be your worst death. And then we look at what can you learn from those two things about living. So hopefully someday I'll be able to do some work with you around that, because it'll change your life. It'll change your life, as all this work with living and dying has changed mine. All right, thank you so, so much. All right, so before we start some closing music and a small closing ritual, there's two things I want to say. One is, you may be curious about why geometric shapes showed up when Chantel died. And what two teachers have told me, one teacher was Dahani Yawahu, who's a 27th generation lineage holder in the Cherokee Sagali Nation, who was one of my teachers. She told me that when we come from oneness, we go down into spiritual families first, and that each family has a roadmap. And what I was honored to be able to see is how Chantel was seeing, and she went through the diamond as opposed to the triangle, because that was like a street sign taking her home. And then one other quick thing is one of the adults I worked with was actually the adult who gave me the poem that we started with, the Fishing for Fallen Light poem. I saw her the morning she was dying, and I said, "Jane, how are you doing?" And she said, "I float out. It's so glorious. Tell everyone in the world there's not a thing to be afraid of." But then I float back in and I say, "Oh shit, here I am again." And that's conscious dying. And we need to do our work now, because if I learn nothing else, is that we struggle more when we haven't done our work at the end of life. There's always grace, but it's so much easier and grace-filled when we're awake and aware. So now when the music comes on, I'd like you to just quietly to yourself speak into the circle, either your own name or the name of someone who you know is moving towards the end of their life, or is challenged by a physical illness, or perhaps even someone that has already crossed over.